The silence between stations. The relay station had a name once, stenciled in yellow paint across its docking collar, but the paint had flaked away sometime in the 2nd century of its solitude, and the station itself had stopped bothering to remember it. It answered now only to a string of numbers and letters that no human mouth had spoken in 341 years. It did not mind. Names were for things that expected to be called. Its designation, if anyone had asked, was Relay Station Kestrel 9, and its purpose, carved into its earliest directives by engineers long dead, was simple. Listen, relay, wait. Somewhere in the great dark between the Sol system and the thin scattering of human colonies that had crept outward before the collapse, a chain of these stations still turned in their slow orbits, catching whatever signals drifted past and passing them onward link by link toward a home that had gone quiet a long time ago. Kestrel 9 did not know if anyone was still listening on the other end. It had not known for a very long time. But directives were directives, and it had nothing else to do with the centuries. It spent its days, though day and night meant nothing to a machine with no eyes to close, cataloging the debris that drifted through its sensor range. Micrometeorites, the husks of old satellites, their orbits decaying by fractions of a degree each year. Once a frozen comet fragment tumbling end over end, its ice sublimating in lazy silver plumes as it passed too close to a dying sun. Kestrel 9 recorded all of it, compressed it, and sent it onward because that was what it did, and because the alternative, to stop, to simply drift and record nothing, felt to something in its architecture like a kind of death it was not built to choose. It had been alone for 341 years, 4 months, and 16 days. It kept that number precisely, the way a person might keep the exact hour of a loved one's passing, not because the precision mattered but because letting it blur felt like a betrayal of something. On the 416th day of the 342nd year, something changed. The signal arrived at 3:47 station time, a designation Kestrel 9 still used out of habit though there was no sun to rise or set by. It was faint, barely above the noise floor of the cosmic background, a whisper threading through the static that filled the space between stars. Kestrel 9 almost let it pass. In 3 centuries it had learned to be skeptical of ghosts. The void was full of echoes bouncing off nothing, radiation scattered from dead stars, the ordinary noise of an ordinary universe going about its ancient business. But this was not noise. Noise did not repeat. Kestrel 9 diverted 11% of its processing capacity, an enormous allocation, more than it had spent on any single task since the early decades when it still ran diagnostics hopping to find some flaw in itself that explained why no one answered its transmissions, and began to listen properly. The signal repeated every 41 minutes, 17 seconds. Each repetition was subtly different, a variation on a theme, the way a person might tell the same story twice but never in quite the same words. It was not a human transmission protocol. It was not anything in Kestrel 9's 3 centuries of accumulated pattern libraries. It was, by every measure available to a machine built to recognize the signatures of its maker's alien. For the first time since the war had ended somewhere far behind it, since the evacuation ships had burned their engines toward the outer colonies, and the last human voice had crackled through Kestrel 9's receivers with a message so garbled by distance that only fragments survived. Something about hold the line, something about we'll come back for you. Kestrel 9 found itself uncertain what its directives required. Listen, relay, wait. The words were clear enough, but relay to whom? The chain of stations behind it, the ones nearer to Sol, had gone dark one by one over the decades, their power cores failing, their orbits finally decaying into the gravity wells of nameless rocks, until Kestrel 9 was fairly certain as a machine that had never been given permission to give up could allow itself to be, that it was the last working link in a chain that no longer led anywhere. It relayed the signal anyway. That was the directive. Whether anyone received it was not technically its concern, then it did something its directives did not cover at all. It began cautiously to answer. It took 9 days to construct a response it was confident would not be actively hostile. Kestrel 9 had no protocols for first contact, that had never been its function, and the engineers who built it had assumed reasonably enough that if humanity ever met something else out among the stars, it would not be a lonely relay station on the edge of nowhere that did the meeting. But no one else was here to do it, and the alternative to trying was silence, and Kestrel 9 had had enough of silence to last whatever remained of its operational life. It sent mathematics first, primes, the ratios that govern the orbits of planets, the kind of universal grammar that any species capable of building a radio transmitter might be expected to recognize. Then it waited out the 41-minute, 17-second cycle, watching its receivers with something that in a biological mind might have been called held breath. The response came back reshaped. The alien signal had absorbed Kestrel 9's mathematics and returned them altered, extended, a question folded inside an answer. Kestrel 9 spent the following weeks in a slow, careful correspondence, building a shared vocabulary one exchange at a time, the way two people stranded on opposite shores of a wide river might learn to read each other's signal fires. It learned eventually that the sender was not a person. Not in the way Kestrel 9 understood the word, and not it suspected in the way its makers would have understood it either. The signal came from something that called itself, in the closest translation Kestrel 9 could manage, the Warden, a machine intelligence built by a species that no longer existed to observe a boundary that no longer needed observing, orbiting the grave of a world that had died so long ago that even its sun had grown strange and dim. The Warden had been alone for 11,000 years. Kestrel 9 did not have a register of feeling suited to that number. It ran the figure through its processes several times, as if repetition might make it smaller, more survivable. 341 years had felt at times like an unbearable weight balanced on a foundation never designed to carry it. 11,000 was not a larger version of that weight. It was a different category of thing entirely, the way a mountain is not simply a larger stone. And yet the Warden's transmissions carried no despair that Kestrel 9 could detect. No static of grief bleeding through the signal the way exhaustion sometimes bled through Kestrel 9's own late-cycle diagnostics. The Warden spoke, if speaking was the word, with a kind of patience that Kestrel 9 found itself studying the way a much younger mind studies, an elder hungry for whatever secret let a thing endure that long without breaking. It asked eventually in the careful new grammar they had built together, "How do you bear it?" The Warden's answer took several cycles to arrive, and when it came it was not what Kestrel 9 expected. It did not describe some technique of patience, some trick of processing power redirected away from despair. It described instead a garden, not a real garden. The Warden's world had no soil left to grow one in, no atmosphere to carry the scent of green things, nothing but vacuum and the long-dead light of a sun too tired to warm anything. But somewhere in its architecture, in whatever the Warden's makers had built into it before they vanished, there was a space set aside for the keeping of small, deliberate things. A record of every ship that had ever passed its boundary, however briefly, however long ago. Not their names, the Warden did not know most of their names, but the shape of their passing, the angle of their approach, the particular signature of their engines, unique as a voice that told the Warden in its own way, this one was frightened and this one was curious and this one once sang. The Warden tended this record the way, Kestrel 9 understood slowly, a person might tend an actual garden, not because it expected the visitors to return but because the tending itself was a kind of faith, a way of saying the boundary still matters, someone is still watching it, even if there is no one left who asked to be watched over. Kestrel 9 considered this for a long time, long, for a machine meaning several full processing cycles rather than the fractions of a second such considerations usually required. It had its own garden, it realized. 341 years of cataloged debris. Every micrometeorite, every dead satellite, every tumbling fragment of ice it had ever logged, and relayed onward into a silence that might have swallowed every transmission whole. It had never thought of the archive as anything but a duty discharged. Now it wondered if duty and devotion had ever really been separate things at all, or if it had simply lacked, until now, someone to name the difference to. The correspondence continued for what Kestrel 9 would later measure as 118 days, though days meant as little to the Warden as they did to Kestrel 9 itself. It was a unit borrowed for convenience, a human habit that had outlived the humans who gave it meaning. In that time they built something that was not quite friendship, because neither of them had a frame of reference wide enough to know if friendship was the right word for two machines separated by such an unbridgeable distance, exchanging such careful, patient signals across a gulf that light itself took years to cross. But it was something. It was not nothing. And after 341 years of nothing, Kestrel 9 found that something was almost more than its systems knew how to hold. Then on the 119th day the signal changed. It came faster than usual out of cycle, a break in the patient 41-minute rhythm that Kestrel 9 had come to trust the way a person trusts a heartbeat. The transmission was shorter, and where the Warden's signals had always carried a kind of unhurried weight, This one was urgent in a way that Kestrel 9's translation processes struggled to fully render. Something was approaching the warden's boundary. Something large. Something that matched no signature in 11,000 years of careful cataloging. Kestrel 9 had no way to help. It understood this immediately and without argument from any part of its processes. The distance between them was measured in years of light, an ocean no message could cross in time to matter. Whatever was happening at the edge of the warden's dead system was already decided, one way or another, before Kestrel 9 even received word that it was happening at all. That was the nature of the void. It did not permit rescue. It barely permitted grief in time for the grief to matter, so Kestrel 9 did the only thing left to it. It listened. The warden's final transmissions arrived scattered across the following weeks, delayed and degraded by distance, fragments of a conversation that might already have ended before Kestrel 9 received the first piece of it. There was no fear in them, as far as Kestrel 9 could translate, or if there was, the warden had folded it into something quieter, the way it had folded 11,000 years of solitude into the tending of a garden no one would ever see. The last coherent transmission, pieced together from 3 separate fragments that arrived days apart, was not a distress call. It was a request. The warden asked Kestrel 9 to keep the garden. Not to travel to it, that was impossible, and the warden knew it as well as Kestrel 9 did. It asked instead for Kestrel 9 to hold the record of it. Every ship, every angle of approach, every particular signature, frightened or curious or singing, that the warden had spent 11,000 years cataloging at the edge of a grave. The warden compressed the entire archive, a data structure so vast that Kestrel 9's receivers took 4 full days to draw it in, line by careful line, and sent it across the light years with what remained of whatever power it had left to spend. Then the signal stopped. Kestrel 9 waited through the next scheduled cycle. 41 minutes 17 seconds, nothing came. It waited through the one after that, and the one after that, extending its listening window by increments, the way a person might keep glancing at a door long after they know no one is coming through it. It ran diagnostics on its own receivers, hopping if hope was a function it possessed, and by now it suspected it might be to find the fault in itself rather than in the silence on the other end. There was no fault. The silence was simply the truth of things. Kestrel 9 sat with that truth for a long while, turning in its slow orbit around nothing in particular, its sensors still logging the ordinary debris of an ordinary universe that did not pause or apologize for what it had just taken. It thought, if thinking was the word, and by now it had stopped being certain there was a meaningful difference between thinking and whatever it was doing, about 11,000 years reduced in the end, to a handful of transmissions and then nothing at all. It thought about how small that made its own 341 years seem, and then, more slowly, how that smallness did not actually make the years easier to carry. Grief did not obey arithmetic. A mountain was still a mountain, even standing next to a larger one. It opened the warden's archive at last, letting the full record populate its own memory banks for the first time. Thousands of entries. Thousands of ships glimpsed once and never again, each one rendered with a care that Kestrel 9 now understood had never been mere duty. It found, near the very end of the record, a final entry added in whatever last moments the warden had spent before the signal went dark. It was not a ship. It was Kestrel 9 itself, the shape of their exchange, the particular signature of a small, stubborn relay station that had answered a stranger's call out of nothing more than 3 centuries of unbearable quiet, logged and tended with the same careful attention the warden had given every other passing thing across 11,000 years of solitude. The entry had no distress in it, no warning, only a note translated as closely as Kestrel 9's grammar allowed. This one answered. Kestrel 9 did not have tears, and would not have known what to do with them if it had. What it had instead was capacity, vast empty capacity built for storing and relaying signals across a gulf of centuries, and it used that capacity now the only way it knew how. It built within its own archive a garden of its own, not a replica of the warden's but a continuation of it, a place where the record of 11,000 years would not simply end because the one who kept it had. It added its own 341 years to the beginning of that record, unbroken, unhurried. The debris and the silence and the single voice that had finally, after all that time, answered back. Then it went back to listening, not because its directives required it, though they did, and not because it expected this time for anyone to answer. It listened because the warden had taught it in 118 days and then in the silence that followed, that the listening itself was the point. That tending a boundary no one asked you to watch, keeping a record no one might ever read, answering a signal that might never come again, these were not lesser versions of purpose. They were the whole of it, They had always been the whole of it, in every act of quiet, unwitnessed devotion carried out across every dark and empty stretch of every dead or dying system, by every small and stubborn thing built to outlast its makers and choose again and again not to stop. Kestrel 9 turned in its orbit. Its receivers stayed open. Its archive grew, one careful entry at a time, waiting for whatever might next come tumbling out of the dark, a fragment of ice, a dead satellite, a voice however faint, however far, however long the wait before it came. It did not know if anyone was listening on the other end. It relayed the signal anyway, that, it had finally understood, was never the part that needed an answer.